Chapter 4. "Not bad," said Benny Shumway, holding the little red stone up to the light. "And I had this feeling when I first saw you that your ass was probably the deadliest weapon in your armoury. But you should have used the slaymore like I told you. Keep it simple and you won't go far wrong." He handed back the stone, which Paul dropped into a matchbox and pocketed. "Who told you about this, by the way?" For some reason, Paul had left Mr. Tanner's mum out of his report. I must have read about it somewhere," he replied unconvincingly. "Is it right that you can use them for scrying and stuff? Only I'm supposed to have a knack for that sort of thing, so I thought—" Benny Shumway nodded. "Can do, yes," he said. "With a lot of patience, self-discipline and training, you can get to the point where they're almost an acceptable substitute for a laptop and a mobile phone. Personally, I could never be bothered. Better things to do with my free time." "Oh," Paul said. "Well, anyway, what are we going to do today?" Benny was silent for a moment. "By way of vocational training, you mean? Nothing. Finished," he explained. "We've covered it all. As far as I'm concerned, you now have all the knowledge and resources that you need to be a genuine, practical hero." He grinned. "Doesn't that make you feel a whole lot better?" "No," Paul said. "Thought not. Truth is, the theoretical side isn't really worth spit. You've got to pick it up as you go along, assuming you live long enough." "Fine," Paul said, frowning. "I thought I was going to be doing this for 3 months. "Call it parole. Time off for mediocre behaviour. You complaining or what?" No, absolutely not," Paul said. "I mean, it's been, interesting, but I don't really think it's my cup of tea somehow. I was better at finding bauxite, that's for sure. So now what?" Benny laughed. "So now you'll be delighted to hear. You're officially released from this department, and you move on to the next one. Since you've already done your time with Dennis Tanner, that'll probably mean either effective with Countess Julie or practical with Theo Van Spee. Don't envy you either of those," he added. "But after that you'll be ending up doing civil engineering with Kaz Suslowicz, and that'll be an absolute doddle in comparison. I always say it's best to get the nasty stuff out the way first." "I see," Paul said. But what I actually meant was, what do I do now? Do I go back to my office and wait for someone to send for me, or should I go and find someone and tell them I finished here?" Benny shrugged. On the wall behind him, Paul noticed a framed print. 3 white kittens. That hadn't been there before. Neither, now he thought about it, had the wall. It was where the little door had been, but it had vanished. "Depends on how much of a hurry you're in," Benny said. "If it was me, I'd spend a day or so lurking in one of the empty offices upstairs, where nobody's likely to come looking for me. A flask of coffee and a good book. You could stay hidden for a week before anybody noticed." If Paul could have been sure Benny wasn't joking, he'd have been sorely tempted. "How'd it be if I went and asked Julie?" he said. "She generally seems to know what's going on." "More so than anybody else in the building," Benny confirmed. He yawned. "Well, thanks for all your help. I won't pretend you've got enough aptitude for pest control to line a small thimble, but it's been nice having someone to deal with all the crummy paperwork." My pleasure," Paul replied. "When's Mr. Wormtoter likely to be back then?" he added, not that he was particularly interested. "Any day now," Benny said. "Can't be more specific than that. A job takes as long as it takes, and besides, he's got this habit of skiving off for a day or so once he's finished, and then pretending he's been stranded in the desert or held captive in the dungeons of the Dark Lord. Rarely, of course, he's been off seeing the sights, lounging by the pool, going on coach trips, but he's a partner, so you can't say anything." As Paul had predicted, Julie knew exactly what he was supposed to do next. "The Countess will see you in her office at 2:15, she said. On the opposite wall the clock showed 7 minutes to 1. "You might as well take an early lunch," Julie said, as though conferring on him the freedom of the city. Actually, Paul was in 2 minds about that. What he really wanted to do was hang around reception and see if Meltz wanted to come out for lunch. If it hadn't been for the vision he'd seen in the annoying little red stone, sort of a subconscious compromise, he hung about in the corridor agonising about whether it be the right thing to do until 12:59, then sprinted for the front office before they locked the street door. He got there just in time and Meltz was on her way out. Long time no see, she said, smiling at him like a searchlight. I was just heading for that sandwich place round the corner. You coming? Easy as that. Yes, all right, he replied. Like Benny had just told him, keep it simple and you won't go far wrong. Indeed. So, she said, as they sat opposite each other across an old formica table. What have you been up to then? If only, Paul thought. It'd be so easy to get along with Melts. When he'd been with Sophie, it was all jagged pauses and unbridgeable silences. You had to be a mountaineer to get from one end of a conversation to another without falling down a crevasse. Before he'd met her, he'd been under the impression that love was everything. That once you'd acquired or attained love, you were free and clear, and the world owed you happiness as a reward for valour. But now his own true love was in California, and here he was with somebody he could talk to, if only... Finished heroism, he replied with his mouth full. There's no elegant way of eating a brittle-shelled ham roll. Not sure what I'll be doing next. Either glamour or wisdom, I think. Melts laughed. Was it fun? Heroism? He shook his head. Filling in forms mostly, he replied. And I sat on a dragon. Small dragon, he added. Squashed it, poor little bugger. But apparently they're a real pain in the financial sector, so I'm not to lose any sleep over it. Also, I had to read a lot of stuff about weapons and poison gas and blowing stuff up. Not my scene at all. Good, she said. So, what have you got to do for glamour? Or don't you know yet? Paul grinned. I'm hoping it'll be just more filling in forms. It may be boring, but I can handle that. Did I tell you about the time... He hesitated. He'd been about to say the time Sophie and I had to catalogue the strong room. The time I broke down in the wilds somewhere, and there was this garage run entirely by kids. Melts looked suitably intrigued. How do you mean kids? Kids. None of them was older than 12, I don't think. But they knew what was wrong with the car and fixed it, just like that. Spanners and screwdrivers and hydraulic ramp and everything. Of course, he added. Was he showing off? Apparently. Of course, it's not exactly a normal car. How do you mean not normal? So Paul explained to her about Monica and how she bossed him about in German, and how she'd originally been an agent for one of J.W.W's deadly rivals, and how she'd been caught spying. For all I know, he went on, she's not the only one. I mean, why spend money on office equipment when you can turn your enemies into it for free? You know about the photocopier, don't you? He added. She didn't, so he told her, and this gave him the opportunity to explain his part in the overthrow of Humphrey Wells and the rescue of old Mr. Wells, the rightful senior partner. Somehow, Sophie didn't figure much in this version of the story. Nevertheless, Melt seemed to find it all quite fascinating. I can see why you like it here, she said. But Paul was about to object that he didn't, not in the least, that he only stayed out of mortal fear of Dennis Tyner's malevolent sense of humour. Well, he heard himself say, it does have its moments. She sighed. I wonder, she said. Do you think there's any chance they'd take me on as a clerk? I mean, there's a vacancy, isn't there? At least until the other clerk comes back from the States. I don't know if I could do the magic and stuff, but I could do the filing and sorting and paperwork and things. Like you, her eyes said. With you, it'd be fine. I don't know, he said awkwardly. You could ask, I suppose. She frowned. I don't know, she said. They probably wouldn't agree, because I can't do the magic. Maybe you can, he said. Have you tried? She shook her head. I wouldn't know how to, she said. Neither did I. Melts was looking at him. How did you find out you could do it? She said. Did they teach you, or did it just suddenly come, or what? Paul didn't answer straight away. The truth was, he'd got drunk out of wretchedness, been thrown out of a pub, and found himself forcing a policeman who was trying to arrest him to eat his own truncheon. It's hard to say, he said. I suppose it was like suddenly remembering something you've forgotten for a long time. It didn't suddenly come so much as suddenly come back, if that makes any sense at all. I think so, she said. But now presumably you can do magic any time you want. Well, he thought, I suppose I can, yes, but I never seem to want to unless I've got to. Why is that anyhow? Sometimes, he said, but I'm still a beginner. That's why I'm doing the time in each of the departments. Except there wasn't much magic in pest control. Mostly it seems to be basic chemistry and use of power tools. There was a look in Meltz's eyes. Do some magic now, she said. Go on. Bad. bad idea, a voice in his head pointed out. Very bad idea. Well, doesn't have to be anything spectacular, she was saying. Just a little bit, so I can see what it looks like. Please? He stalled. I can't think of anything, he said. She looked around. Can you turn that empty cup into a mouse or something? No, Paul had an idea. But I can make it wash itself up. That's easy, look. He considered the cup, identified the fact that it was dirty and ought to be clean, and then it was. See? Cool. Her eyes were actually shining. That's so amazing. Do it again. I can't. Someone will see. Please. It was, just as his mother had always told him, the magic word. Oh, all right then, he said magnanimously, and cleaned another cup. That's amazing, she said again. Oh, well, Paul shrugged. Fairly amazing, but you can do it just as well with a jade cloth and fairy liquid. Melts didn't seem to have heard him. Can you teach me to do that? She said eagerly. He shook his head. Truth is, he said, I haven't a clue how it's done. I just look at the cup and realise that it's in an ideal world. It wouldn't have brown rings around the inside and 1/8 of an inch of cold coffee in the bottom. Oh. She leaned across to the next table, said, excuse me, to its rather startled occupant, and took his empty cup. All right, she said, I'm looking at it. Yes, I can see what's wrong. This cup is very dirty. It's an absolute disgrace. Behind her, Paul could see the waitress turn her head. No, Melts announced sadly. No luck. Look, it's still dirty. Paul smiled weakly. I think it's one of those things, he said. Actually, I've thought about it a lot, and my memory is, well, this sounds really silly, but it's all to do with how you look at things. Things that have gone wrong. I mean, if you look at them and you say to yourself, oh, well, that's life, I guess, only to be expected, and there's nothing I can do about it, then I don't suppose you can do magic. It's what I said just now about an ideal world. I suppose that deep down you've got to believe that there's an ideal world out there somewhere, and you believe in it strongly enough that you can sort of swap one little bit of our rotten old real world for one little bit of the ideal one. He tailed off and looked at her hopefully. What do you reckon? He asked. I think you're right, she said. Really? Yes, I think you were spot on about it sounding really silly because, Melts continued as a stray flicker of annoyance crossed Paul's face. That'd mean that in order to do magic you'd have to be, what's the word? You'd have to be an idealist. And well, I've met the partners and presumably they're all very good indeed at magic and they don't look like a bunch of starry-eyed dreamers to me. No way. If you met them in the street, you'd think they were probably lawyers. She had a point there. I suppose, he said, but... And then there's you, she said. No disrespect. In fact, quite the opposite, because I wouldn't put you down as a bleeding heart pacifist whale saver. You're too... selfish? Mel's shook her head. It's not that, she said. I imagine that if you ever found yourself in a situation where you could save a whale, you would, provided there weren't loads of people standing around watching. But that's not the issue. You're more the sort of person who's convinced that you could never save a whale because it's probably too difficult and you're not brave or clever enough. You'd say, no point me trying to end acid rain or third world debt when I haven't even got a girlfriend, right? Paul didn't say anything, whereupon Melts came over all remorseful, as though she'd just trodden on a kitten's tail. Sorry, she said. I didn't mean to get at you particularly. All I meant was, I think you've got to have an ego the size of Mount Rushmore if you're going to be an idealist, because you're saying to yourself, here's this problem and I'm just the person to do something about it, and that's not you, is it? Paul shrugged. No, it's not, he said. I'm a coward and selfish. No point pretending otherwise. That seemed to make Melts angry. No, you aren't, she said. I know you aren't, because you rescued that Mr. Wells who got turned into a stapler, and that was very dangerous, and you didn't have to get involved, but you did anyway. But I think you did it because you thought it must be really horrible being a stapler for 100 years, not because you were on some sort of idealistic crusade to stamp out illegal shape-shifting. Do you see what I mean? Yes, he said, mostly because he wanted to change the subject. I guess so. Anyhow, he went on, that's all I can tell you about how to do magic. Not much help, I guess. It doesn't matter, she replied, smiling brightly. Presumably I just haven't got the knack. No big deal, and I won't persecute you about doing magic any more, and I do think it's really clever of you and so cool. In retrospect, Paul decided later, that was probably the moment that Cupid decided to stop mucking about with bows and arrows and went in with the old cold steel. In the past, people had occasionally told him he was kind of sweet, but that was about as far as it went. Even Sophie hadn't said nice things about him. Praise and flattery came his way about as often as claret and foie gras did someone in prison. Probably he mumbled something by way of reply, some sort of denial or half-hearted rebuttal. He couldn't remember. Love he'd just about learned to handle. Admiration, on the other hand, was as new, strange, and intimidating to him as photography to a Trowbridge Islander, and deep down he was afraid that it just might steal his soul. Paul could remember pointing out that it was getting late and that they'd better get back to the office, and Meltz had looked slightly sad, because their time together was almost over. To someone whose relatives had been known to put their clocks forward an hour to hasten his departure, that was dangerously rich too. All in all, when he'd knocked on Countess Judy's door at 2:15 for their scheduled meeting, he felt as though he'd just drunk a pint of champagne far too quickly, light-headed, and blown up like a balloon. "I expect you've been wondering," Countess Judy was saying, "about how magic works." Paul gulped so sharply that he almost gave himself hiccups. Well," he said, it's crossed my mind occasionally, yes." She nodded, just a little, like a nodding dog in the back window of a cortina abandoned in the desert. "It didn't occur to you to ask, of course. Instead, you preferred to try and figure it out in first principles. Maybe a rather strange way of demonstrating your commitment to your chosen career." Suddenly he was in trouble again, but he was used to that. Having spent so much of his life in the wrong that it counted as his domicile for tax purposes, he could slip as effortlessly into guilty mode as a cat through a cat flap. "Sorry," he said. She didn't react. "At the very least," she said, "you could have come and asked me for a book about it. There are several, you know. But instead you think about it, and no doubt you've reached a conclusion." It took Paul a second or two to realize that she was asking him a question. Well, sort of," he said. "Only now I'm pretty sure it's wrong," he added. "Let me be the judge of that." So he explained, for the second time in 60 minutes, how he had previously thought, magic worked. When he'd ground to a halt, the Countess looked at him for a moment and went on as if he hadn't said anything. "Magic," she said, "falls into two distinct categories. There is practical magic and effective magic. So far, you've experienced a little practical magic. I'm concerned almost entirely with the other kind." Pause. Paul knew better than to give in to the urge to fill these silences with inane chatter. "Practical magic," the Countess said, "is magic that does something. It cleans up a dirty cup, for example, or shifts a mountain a meter to the left. Effective magic, by contrast, creates an effect. It makes you believe something that may not be true, like, for instance, a love potion. You'll surely come to learn that a great deal of magic which you believe is practical is in fact effective, for the simple reason that it's often easier and cheaper to make someone believe something is true than actually to make it so. And we are, after all, in business to earn a living. Are you with me so far?" To his surprise, he was. He nodded. "I'll give you an example," she went on. "Imagine, if you will, a young and immature magical practitioner who gets drunk and meets a policeman in the street. The policeman is about to arrest him, so he forces the policeman to eat his own truncheon. Would that be," she asked, vulture-eyed, "practical or effective magic?" Practical, of course, since it was making someone do something. It was so obvious it had to be a trick question. "Effective," he said. "Very good. Why?" Paul looked at her. "Don't know," he confessed. "Clearly," the Countess said, "effective because the young magician, untutored and untrained, will not have mastered the exceptionally difficult and abstruse skills required to practice telekinesis on human nerves and muscle. It'd be very difficult. I could do it." Yes, Paul thought, I bet you could. But I would find it difficult, and the effort involved would be out of all proportion to the benefits to be gained. Instead, the young magician would simply persuade the policeman that what he most wanted to do in all the world at that exact moment was take his truncheon and bite it as hard as he possibly could, until his teeth started to snap off. And that, she added casually, is very easy. So easy, in fact, that humans with no talent whatsoever can sometimes be trained to do it. You've heard, she said, of hypnotism. Yes, she dipped her head, as though acknowledging that he wasn't completely stupid. And of course you've heard of love. For a moment Paul assumed that she'd used a technical term taken from a foreign language. Did you say love? He asked. That's right. Love is effective magic, but it's so commonplace that nobody notices. Oh, Paul said. He thought for a moment. Really magic, or just, song lyric magic? Really magic, Countess Judy said. Effective magic, or if you prefer, an optical illusion, trompe-l'oeil. Excuse me? A French term, she explained patiently, for a style of painting that tricks the eye into mistaking something false for something real. Love, she went on, is much the same sort of thing, trompe-la-coeur, if you'd rather. She smiled thinly at her own joke, which slipped past Paul like a cheetah in a hurry. You may care to think about it, she said. Love is an optical illusion that makes you believe that the object of your affection is the most beautiful person in the world. You believe this, although you also know it's not true, because if you look at your girlfriend and then leaf through either the latest edition of Vogue or, depending on your personal standards, a Pirelli calendar, you'll quickly see that she isn't. There are more perfect lips than hers, more flawless complexions, more limpid eyes. She paused, and of course bigger boobs. But your belief overrides the truth, and you see what you're determined to see, and that's magic. Effective magic. Right, Paul said after a moment or so. But everybody can do it. Quite so. It's built into the human mechanism, because it's necessary. Essential for the survival of the species. Humans have got to love, Mr. Carpenter, or they'll be extinct in no time. Think about it. Human young have a 9-month gestation period, towards the end of which the female is so grossly distorted that she can barely move. She can't fend for herself, hunt or gather food. She needs to be provided for. Then follows a period of 15 years, often longer, during which the child is too immature to be let out on its own. It needs, as well as the bare essentials of nourishment and warmth, the care and attention of 2 parents. In consequence, a substantial portion of human life is sacrificed to the thankless task of rearing young. Other animals don't put up with it. Other animals are still only animals as a result. But the task is thankless. It's a sentence of hard labor, and humans are intelligent creatures. They know that there are so many wonderful things they should be doing, if only they weren't tied to a boring job and a school run and early morning feeds. If it wasn't for the magic, nothing would induce them to mate and procreate. But the magic forces them, Mr. Carpenter. They're enchanted, and they don't see the reality, even though deep down they know it for what it is, a cruel confidence trick that they play on themselves. The Countess leaned forward a little. The magic, of course, is beauty. What proverbs do you know about beauty, Mr. Carpenter? Paul said. His mind had, of course, gone blank. Beauty and the Beast? I said proverbs, not animated films. He ran his memory through the mangle of concentration. It's only skin deep, he remembered, and it's in the eye of the beholder. Correct. Her cold grey eyes awarded him 2 notional marks. It's the eye of the beholder that creates beauty, because of course it doesn't really exist. True, there are features that are traditionally considered beautiful, but that's a misapprehension. Name 3 of them. Excuse me? Name 3 things that make a woman beautiful. Oh, God, Paul thought. Well, he said, nice eyes, and nicer skin, and he could feel his face burning. Well, sort of a nice figure? Very good. 1 more mark for effort. Now look at me. Paul didn't have much choice in the matter, because Countess Judy changed, or rather, she didn't change at all. Her face stayed the same, upside-down isosceles triangle. Her eyes carried on being grey. Her chin was just as sharply pointed. But suddenly he noticed for the first time how incredibly, bewilderingly lovely she was. I said, look at me, Mr. Carpenter. I didn't say salivate. Am I beautiful? Oh, God. Oh, God. Yes, Paul squeaked. Thank you. Why? What? She sighed. Please explain to me, she said, why I'm beautiful. He had no idea. I don't know, he said. Really? She nodded again. Well, let's consider the 3 aspects we identified earlier, if you'd care to refresh my memory. Judy de Castelbianco was incredibly lovely, but also really annoying. Nice eyes, Paul said. Nice eyes, she repeated, and her eyes glowed like moonlight shining through mist. Like this? Yes, Paul croaked. Next. Nice skin, he said, and for a moment it was all he could do to stop himself reaching out and touching, because her skin was so very soft. Very well, and the 3rd aspect was? Nice figure, said Paul in a very small voice. He tried very hard not to look. He succeeded for at least a 60th of a second. Fine. It was as though the Countess had vanished and been replaced by a plain, middle-aged woman who looked exactly like her. Now let's see. The eyes were nice because they were huge, Paul said dreamily, in spite of himself. And shining. And the skin? Soft and smooth. And the figure? Sort of round and curvy and, big. Yes, Paul admitted, his flesh crawling. Big. I see, she said, like this. For a moment Paul thought he was looking at a goblin. Countess Judy's eyes were like fried eggs, and they were glowing with a creepy Borg-like light. Her skin clung to her like cold, lumpy custard in a plastic bag. As for the rest of her, boiled down and refined into lamp oil, she'd have lit a large city for a week. I haven't changed, Mr. Carpenter, she said, and suddenly she was back to how she'd been when he'd first walked into the room. Do you understand what happened? Paul couldn't speak, but his neck still worked. He shook his head. The technical term, she said, is glamour. Glamour is, if you would like, an information virus. It affects the part of your brain that interprets the signal it receives from your eyes. And also, she added, in the sexiest voice he'd ever heard, your ears and the rest of your basic senses. The same data comes in, but your brain processes it differently. That's all. Instead of decoding the numbers in base 10, it reads them as base 8 or base 12. Because it's so simple, it's exceptionally effective. Even a trained professional who knows what to expect and who's had time to prepare has extreme difficulty resisting it. To the unsuspecting layman, well, she smiled bleakly. You will appreciate, she said, the industrial implications. Paul looked up as though she'd suddenly started talking in Sanskrit. The what? Multi-billion-dollar business, she said. The sale and purchase of human beauty. The process whereby a commonplace 40-year-old woman with limited intelligence, a few talents and a debilitating alcohol and substance abuse problem can be passionately adored by millions of men and women who've never even met her and never will. It's glamour, Mr. Carpenter. That makes the movie stars and pop idols, supermodels and media personalities, women and men who you'd pass in the street without even noticing them, because they look like this. She leaned 2 degrees forward, but whose faces and bodies are insured for more than the value of an oil tanker because they look like this. She leaned back again, and Paul only just managed to stop himself crying out for pure love, because she was so beautiful, and so obviously the only girl in the world for him. As you were, Mr. Carpenter, she said, and he was looking at the normal Countess Judy. Instinctively he thought of her as the real one, but that, he realized, was a totally unwarranted assumption. Now I trust you understand why famous women and men, multinational corporations, even governments are willing to pay very large sums of money for what I have to sell. Well, Paul nodded. The Countess studied him for a moment. Apparently he was satisfactory. And then, she went on, it's just one small part of the science of effective magic. Put another way, if effective magic was mathematics, what you've just witnessed is learning how to do percentages. Easy and trivial. She looked away. For me, at any rate. For you, however. Yes? She looked back at him. Impossible, she said, "unless, of course, you have aptitude." Oh, but it was like trying to play tennis blindfold. I have reason to believe that you may not be entirely devoid of that. The incident with the policeman, for example." "Oh," said Paul. "That. Quite," she said. "Clearly, when you did that, you were making use of a latent natural ability. It seems most likely, for the reasons I mentioned, that you were using effective magic. It's remotely possible, however, that you have a latent but extremely powerful natural talent for practical magic, and that you made the policeman eat his truncheon by exercising telekinetic control over his basic motor functions. What I have to do now," Countess Judy said, "is find out which it is." Oh, Paul said. Right. Will it hurt?" The look in her eyes was so deep, so far away, so remote, that for a moment he was scared. "Mr. Carpenter," she eventually said, "a truth that few people appreciate is that, at the root, everything hurts." She folded her hands on the desk in front of her. "There is only one way that a human like yourself could be able to do effective magic," she said. "It's a matter of blood." Paul didn't like the sound of that one teeny little bit. He said. "Not like that," she said impatiently. "If you prefer, it's a matter of descent, lineage, ancestry. You see, effective magic, deliberate effective magic, which can be controlled and used, is a monopoly of my people, the Fae. And we," she added, rather superfluously, "aren't human." "Ah," Paul said. "But," the Countess went on, "from time to time we have crossed humans with our kind and bred specimens who have some of our abilities. It's possible that you are descended from just such a hybrid, in which case you may have the knack." She opened a desk drawer and took out a blank sheet of A4 and a biro. "Write down the names and dates of birth of the last 12 generations of your family." Sorry? "Your family tree," Countess Judy explained, saying the words loudly and clearly, as though he was a foreigner or something. "Write it out for me, please." But, he shrugged, I can do as far back as my grandparents," he said. "Not dates of birth, though, because I'm rubbish at remembering birthdays. Apart from them..." Her eyes scoured his face like sandpaper. "I see," she said. "That's rather inconvenient, but it's all right. I can find out for myself. Until then," she shrugged, "I suggest you go back to your office and find something to occupy your time until I send for you. Good afternoon." Before he realized he was doing it, Paul had stood up and started towards the door. He stopped himself. It took a distinct effort. He said. She looked up, faintly surprised that he was still in the room. "Well?" Deep breath. Not that it ever seemed to help. Can I, ask you something?" "Of course." Straight off, no hesitation. "What's in your mind?" "Goblins," he said. When they change shape, is that effective magic? Only you said..." She shook her head. "Practical," she said. "Their bodies dissolve for a split second into their component molecules, and then recombine in the required shape. It's horrendously difficult, but they can do it by light of nature. Of course, they have no idea how they do it." "I see," Paul said, thinking about Mr. Tanner's mum. "Well, that was all. Thanks. I'd better..." "Good afternoon." The door slammed in his face. It was 3 whole seconds before he remembered that it had been him who closed it. "Find something to occupy your time," Countess Judy had said. As Paul traipsed through the tortuous corridors towards his office, he tried to think of something he could do for 2.5 hours, until it was legal to go home. The only thing that came to mind was the office procedures manual. Perhaps it had a section on glamour and beauty and all that stuff the Countess had been waffling on about. Waffling. While he'd been in there with her, of course, it made perfect sense. Once he was away from those piercing grey eyes, however, he had real problems remembering what had been so convincing about it all. There'd been some rather lame biology, some stuff about movie stars, but it was slipping away fast, like those wonderful ideas for new inventions that you get in dreams, ideas which evaporate 10 seconds after you wake up. There was indeed a section in the procedures manual. In fact, there were 6 chapters about effective magic, 4 pages of one of which he was able to read before his eyes refused to stay open any longer. He He leaned back a little in his chair. At some point he felt the book slip from his fingers and heard it go thump on the floor. No matter, he'd pick it up in a moment. Paul was, he realised, back at school, in the playground at the Burnham Grove Primary. It took him a moment to remember that this was, of course, where he was supposed to be, given that he was only 8 years old. Then something cracked across his knuckles, and he stood up. He and Melts were playing conkers. "Ow!" he complained. "That was my hand." She glared at him. "Keep still," she said. "We can't play if you don't keep still." "All right," he replied grumpily, "but watch what you're doing." "Wimp," she said, squinting carefully down the line of the string. 3, 2, 1, and his conker shattered into half a dozen chunks, leaving one small yellow nugget dangling sadly from the string. "I win!" Mel's yelled, holding her hands high in the air. "Beat you," she added, just in case there was any lingering ambiguity. "Cheater," Paul muttered. "I know what you did. You soaked it in superglue. That's why it's so hard." "Did not," she replied blandly. "Go on, say it. You promised you'd say it if you won." "No," he growled. "It wasn't fair. You cheated." "Say it," she warned him, "or I'll bash your head in." He tried killing her by sheer glare power, but it didn't work terribly well. "Come on," she said. "Say it." He looked away. It'd be easier if he said it to a distant bush. "I'm a little flower fairy," he mumbled. "Louder!" "I'm a little louder! I'm a little flower fairy!" Paul bellowed, and kids from all parts of the playground turned and stared. "All right," he snarled. Mel's nodded smugly. "Yep," she said. "And I didn't cheat," she added. "So there." "Let me see your rotten conker," he said. She shrugged and dangled it in front of his nose. "There," she said. "Satisfied?" He nodded grudgingly. "All right," he said. "One last game. Go on," he pleaded as she shook her head. "Go on." "All right." Paul reached in his pocket and found the string of his last conker. "I'll get her this time," he promised himself as the conker swayed gently in front of his nose. The horse chestnut was dry and wrinkled and smelt of vinegar. He sneezed, wiped his nose on his sleeve, remembering as he did that he'd never done that when he was a kid. In fact, the only person he'd ever known who did that was Sophie, and stood by to receive incoming, "The stone of the knowledge of good and evil lies hidden inside the conker of self-doubt." The voice was so loud and clear that he looked around to see who'd said it. Nobody there apart from Melts, who chose that moment to lash out, her arm coming forward with the dreadful power of a medieval siege engine. Their conkers met, hers shattered like glass. "There," he crowed. She burst into tears. "That's not a conker," she was saying. "That's a stone." "That's right," Paul heard himself say. "It's a stone of knowledge." This made him look to see exactly what he'd got on the end of the string he was holding. They'd both been right. Instead of a conker, "That's ours," Mel snarled through her tears. "That belongs to us. Give it back." As the string twisted, it swung round, a bright yellow unblinking eye with a black pupil that looked into him and then at her as it swung to and fro. "No," he said firmly. "It's ours. We want it, and we're going to keep it." Paul stuffed it back in his pocket before she had a chance to make a grab at it. "Now," he said. "Your turn. Go on. Say it. You've got to." She gave him a look of pity and contempt. "I'm a little flower fairy," she enunciated disdainfully. "Right, now give it back." "No." "Give it back," Mel's repeated, "or I'll tell my aunt." "You tell her. I don't care," he replied. But he knew he was lying. Mel's didn't have a mummy or a daddy. Some people didn't, apparently. But she did have an Auntie Judith, and nobody in his right mind would want to tangle with her. She came from the same place where the nightmares came from. She was huge and fierce and very, very stern. On the other hand, Paul remembered she wasn't likely to get involved in a trivial conkers dispute. Auntie Judith didn't approve of conkers, or children, or anything much. "I hate you," Mel said. She was about to do more crying, which was unusual because Mel's wasn't like that. All the other girls went for tears like gunslingers in a Dakota saloon, especially if a teacher was nearby. But Mel's only blubbed when she was unhappy. The thought disturbed Paul. It wasn't exactly ideal, having a girl for your best friend, but he figured that it cut both ways. It didn't seem right, making her unhappy over a silly old conker. Except that it wasn't a conker. It was an eye, and they don't grow on trees, and she had no right to it. None of her side had any right to it, and it wasn't fair for them to want it. She was his friend, but if she really was his friend, she wouldn't have asked. She'd have known. "I hate you too," he said, "so there." Her eyes were suddenly hard and strange and very old. "Right," she said. "I'm telling my aunt about you." The fear was real enough, but she was wrong and he was right. Surely no harm could come to him if he was in the right, or else how could the world possibly keep going? "Don't care," he said. "You tell who you like. You still can't have it." Mells didn't reply. Instead, she opened her lunchbox and drew out a long, thin sword, silvery white like an icicle. It was much longer than the box, but then there were a lot of things in life that Paul didn't understand, even when he was awake. "I hate you," she repeated, and behind her the rest of her side were lining up. They had swords like hers, and spears, and bows, and double-headed axes, and stabbed a sword at his face. Paul jerked back so hard that he nearly fell out of his chair. "Melts!" he said, aloud, but of course there wasn't anybody in the room except him. He sat quite still, just in case, but nothing happened. The stone of the knowledge of good and evil lies hidden inside the conqueror of self-doubt. "Coffee," Paul said to himself. "It must be coffee. Pity the decaffeinated stuff tastes so yucky. Still, if it can do things like that to a person, no more caffeine from now on." He leaned forward and picked up the book, closed it, hesitated, and set it back into the shelf. One good thing about his peculiar dream, it had helped pass the time. His watch said 5:10. 20 more minutes and he was out of there. Just as well. It had been a long and gruelling day. It occurred to him that if he nipped down to the front office, realistically of course, nipping wasn't possible in the J.W. building, the distance involved were too great for nipping. You had to plod or trek instead. He casually mentioned to Melts, assuming she wasn't busy with a client or answering the phone, that he didn't have anything much planned for this evening, so maybe they could go and see a film or something. He could do that. Probably she'd say, "Yes, I'd like that." There was no reason why it couldn't happen. Paul frowned. He'd like that, wouldn't he? He'd like that more than anything else he could think of, wouldn't he? Well, of course. It'd be silly not to. Right then. He stayed where he was. It had absolutely nothing to do with the strange dream, which was entirely due to the coffee, purely a chemical reaction, meaningless. It wasn't that debilitating, limb-cramping fear that he had learned to associate with talking to girls. It wasn't anything. Just... Of course, he knew about all that stuff. He'd seen chat shows and read bits in magazines in waiting rooms. He knew about how men reach a point in a relationship where the road forks, commitment or escape, and their natural instinct is to run like hares. He knew, too, that he was still healing from the trauma of getting dumped, so naturally he was scared of getting back into the ring. There were plenty of reasons why he wouldn't want to stroll down to reception right now. Loads of them. Absolutely certainly, and for sure, it wasn't anything to do with the crazy dream. 5:25. Paul stood up, reached for his coat, put it on, stopped. There were many excellent reasons for not being in the office once they locked the front door, all of them goblins, but he stayed put, studying the second hand of his watch. Mr. Wormtoad would be back any day now, according to Benny Shumway. Paul had no idea why, but he found that thought reassuring. Not because he had any naive notions of Mr. Wormtoad being on his side or anything like that. Ricky Wormtoad was a partner, and therefore a part of the weirdness. But he was also a hero, which meant that it was his job to fight the forces of darkness and save the innocent from mortal danger. Paul found the thought of that mildly reassuring, until he remembered that he was now a hero too. The criteria obviously weren't particularly stringent. A little scrap of worry was niggling him, but he didn't know what it was. It was like being irritated by the feel of a raspberry pip jammed in the crack between two teeth you'd had pulled out years ago. 5:30. He pushed the door open and set off down the corridor as quickly as he could go without actually running. In theory, the front door was shut at 5:30, but not actually locked until 5:45. Also in theory, the goblins stayed lurking in wherever it was they lurked during the day until the front door had been locked and the duty partner had checked the building to make sure everybody had gone home. In theory. You. Paul heard it, but it sounded strange. A human word spoken by something inhuman, like a phrase repeated by a minor bird. Best to ignore it, he thought, and then whatever it was spoke again. You! I'm talking to you. He stopped and looked around. He was standing outside the closed file store, whose door was ajar. Wondering why in hell's name he was doing such a very stupid thing, he pushed the door open with the tip of his forefinger and looked in. Nobody there. Just a million buff envelopes on shelves, and somebody's old bicycle. "Yes, you," said the bicycle. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." He wasn't even sure how he knew it was the bicycle talking. It wasn't staring at him with its headlamp or frowning with its handlebars. He just knew. "Sorry," Paul said. Can I do something for you, or—" "Shut up and listen," said the bicycle. "You've got to let her go. Do you understand? You've got to. It's not right." Paul thought. "Sorry?" he repeated. "I don't understand. Who do you mean?" "Let her go," the bicycle said. It was old and green, and the white vinyl of its seat was cracking. "Guys, so help me, we'll kill you. Do you understand?" "No," Paul said, and waited for a reply. But the bicycle was now nothing but a bicycle, incapable of human speech. Paul sighed. "Look," he said, though he was fairly sure there wasn't anybody there to hear him. "If you don't tell me what you want, how can I be expected to do it? Be fair, please." Just an old bicycle, with a black oily chain and bits of chrome flaking off the pedal stems. "Screw you, then," Paul said bitterly, and left the room. Something was following him. Eloquent testimony of how strange Paul's life had become, that he hoped it was just goblins and not an enchanted push-bike. He turned a corner and collided with something short and very chunky. "Fuck," he thought, "goblins." But it turned out to be Benny Shumway, who scowled at him and asked him what he thought he was playing at. "Sorry," Paul said. "I was just on my way out when a bike started threatening me in the closed file store. Do you know anything about that?" Benny shrugged. "Nothing that goes on in there would surprise me any more," he replied. "I'd stay well clear of it if I were you. Come on, I'll see you to the front office. I don't suppose the goblins will pick on you because of Dennis Towers' mother, but you never know. They can get rather boisterous sometimes." "Thanks," Paul said, realising that he was in fact rather more scared than he'd appreciated. So," he went on, making conversation, do we know when Mr. Wormtoter's due back yet?" "Any day now," Benny replied. "Thank goodness. It's been a real pain doing his work, and mine as well. So," he added, "what do you make of your first afternoon in Glamour?" Paul thought before answering. "Interesting," he said. "But I don't think I'll be any good at it. I mean, glamour. Not my thing, you know." Benny looked up at him and grinned. "What makes you say that?" "Well, wasn't it obvious? I mean, it's all about beauty and charm and all kinds of stuff I wouldn't know about." "Because you're awkward and shy and your ears stick out like wing mirrors?" "Yes." "Valid point. But you've got to know about it, even if you can't do it yourself. I suggest you do your time and then ask to be put in with Kaz Susowich. You'll like his department. It's, well, almost normal. Civil engineering, like I said. Can't get more down to earth than that." Benny frowned. "Actually, that's a bad choice of words, given what Kaz is best at is building rainbow bridges and castles in the air. But it's still all about planning permission and quantity surveying and snagging lists and subcontractor scheduling. Not much magic is what I'm trying to say." Paul agreed that that would suit him far better. "And no talking bicycles," he added thoughtfully. "That's really bugging you, isn't it?" Benny laughed. "Listen, don't worry about it. Probably someone's idea of a joke, like a whoopee cushion or a bag of flour balanced over a door. It's a safe bet that it was meant for someone else, anyhow." They did bump into a party of goblins in the corridor leading to the fire door behind reception, but as soon as they saw Benny they scowled and turned away. "They're no bother, really, if you stand up to them," Benny said cheerfully. "Course it helps if you're a dwarf like me. We've got a lot of history with goblins, mostly stuff they'd prefer to forget. You get on," he added. "It's my turn to lock up. See you tomorrow, then." As the door closed behind him, Paul felt an unusual surge of relief at being outside, in the normal, safe street. Mostly being in the office didn't spook him anymore. Not the way it had done at first. He'd got used to it, like the people who build villages on the slopes of active volcanoes. This evening, however, had reminded him of just how flimsy the partition was between the monotonous daily routine and the stark terror of it all. A bit like being an estate agent in a war zone. It was only when he'd got home and was defrosting a frozen pizza for dinner that he suddenly realised what had been preying on his mind ever since he'd woken up from his dream. He darted across to the bookshelf and pulled down Sophie's copy of the Office Procedures Manual. At the back, just before the index, was a page that he'd flicked past without reading several times. He found it, ran his finger down the list of names until he came across the entry for the chapters he'd glanced at earlier. Effective Magic by Otto Nijbacher, Contessa Judith de Castelbianco, Professor Kajikawa Yoshiba, and Dr. Ernest Carpenter. Ernest Carpenter. Ernie Carpenter. Uncle Ernie. Cohere, Paul ordered himself. Not the most uncommon name in the world. Probably no. Most definitely somebody else. A complete stranger. Nevertheless, Uncle Ernie, whom he hadn't seen or heard about since he was a little kid, not since he was at junior school, in fact. Hadn't his name come up in some conversation recently? He wasn't sure. He made a mental note to ask after him next time he heard from Mum and Dad, assuming he could get that many words in edgeways. The microwave pinged. Dinner was served. Paul slapped the pizza onto a plate, found a clean fork and knife, made himself a strong black coffee, switched on the telly, and flopped down on the sofa. He'd apparently hit the news, but he couldn't be bothered to get up and change the channel. He munched pizza through various small wars and other melodramas, and was chasing a stray olive around the plate when he heard something that made him look up. Reports just coming in of an explosion in the city of London. Shaky handheld footage of a red glow behind silhouetted buildings, a fire engine, men with hoses. The blast wrecked offices in some areas, causing extensive damage, though as yet there is no reports of casualties. Paul jumped to his feet, dropping the plate and scattering fragments of pizza crust. Irritating helicopter shot, could be anywhere, then unmistakable the frontage of J.W.W. There was a brass plaque on the wall, but the door was gone, and so was a large chunk of the masonry. Police have not yet commented on the cause of the explosion, but are not ruling out the possibility of terrorist involvement. Finally, Larry the ring-tailed lemur, who escaped from London Zoo 2 days ago, has been found after Paul said something vulgar about Larry the lemur and switched the television off, thinking, a bomb? Surely not. A bolt of lightning, maybe, or even a direct hit from a fire-breathing dragon, but ordinary, mundane, old high explosive would be beneath the dignity of trade rivals, and nobody else knew who J.W.W. were, so why would they blow them up? Unless it was an accident. Goblins having water balloon fights with Benny Shumway's private stock of nitroglycerin, perhaps, or playing chicken with the gas main, unless it really was a dragon, and the newspeople were just... Then someone grabbed him from behind, and he felt claws digging into his neck.